All right. Hello, and welcome to the Pragmatic Live podcast series, where we tackle the biggest challenges facing today's product management, product marketing, and other market and data driven professionals with some of the best minds in the industry. I'm Rebecca Calageris, Vice President of Marketing and Product Strategy at Pragmatic Institute, and your host for this episode. I am extremely excited today to have Dan Balcauski, Principal Consultant at Product Tranquility, where he focuses on working with B2B SaaS organizations and kind of improving evaluation, right? He's also a longtime Pragmatic fan. Welcome, Dan.
Thank you so much for having me, Rebecca.
So, first, let's give our audience a little bit of context for this conversation. Can you tell me a little bit about you and your background and where your work focuses today?
Yeah, sure. So way back in the day, I started my career on the software development side of the house, and that was fantastic. But eventually, I realized that I was better suited to focusing on the customers and where the code and we how we wrote that the product we built provided value and how that turned into dollars for the company. And so over time, I migrated into a engineering management position and then product management after that, and spent a good amount of time in different product management roles at a series of companies and increasing levels of leadership. And yeah, my journey, from entry level PM to now has, it's taken many forms. So I've worked mostly my entire career in technology companies, and of those mostly B2B. Although prior gig was in at a marketplace, two-sided marketplace company as well.
So you've got lots of different experience and background, a varied background, right? You're a recovering developer, lots of product management experience. But one of the things I think that you've really, the levers that you've pulled throughout your career and that you do today and as you work with companies is the idea of bringing qualitative and quantitative insights forward. And so that's kind of where I'm hoping we can dive in today. So let's start with that. Let's talk about, in your view, when you are working on understanding your customers, your market, your products, where do you turn? What techniques do you use to get those insights?
Yeah, absolutely. So qualitative and quantitative, I view, really have to be in balance. They One only gives you half the story, and I say that as a self-professed data nerd. My engineering experience, my love of math growing up, I just love the data. I love the numbers, but you can only get so far with them. And so as you think about I think you do have to start with the business goals, which are usually quantitative based. And from there, uh, the as you start to figure out where your customers are deriving value, there's really no substitute for talking to them. Um, the main reason why that is you don't really have, as good as I've seen over my career, the our ability to get really fine grained data from customers, especially with the advent of software as a service, our ability to get microsecond by microsecond updates of what customers are doing with our platforms, all of the data exhaust from our go to market systems and customer support platforms that we're able to leverage. You still don't have the full context for how customers, where it is in their in that you fit in the life of your customers. So the entire story around, yeah, it's great that you can tell that they were, in your UI, and they clicked a button, and maybe they achieved a goal, but you don't know what they were doing outside of that, 5 minutes ago when they were using another product. You don't have any idea of, the um, emotions, the anxieties that your customer is facing in their job, or as a prospect. And so, I find myself, always pushing, product managers to, whatever they tend to fall on one side of the fence or the other, of being very heavy on qualitative or on quantitative. And my suggestion is always, if you're leaning heavy on one, you really need to come back the other way, and vice versa. Um, and when you're having these moments of discovery, right? Then you can build these stories from your customers and use that to really drive change inside the organization as well. So this is I think ultimately, right, as I think about persuasion of stakeholders, they tend to get moved by two things. One is business results, but then the other is stories directly from the customer's mouth, and it's very difficult to just show an executive the result of an A/B test and have them have a strong emotional reaction to that. And so coming with your data, having that supported is important, but you also need to have the human component as well.
Yeah, I like to say that they're often moved by the qualitative, but they're driven by the quant, right? So those two sides are really, really key. So one of the areas that I think the quantitative and qualitative approach is so important, one area that I know you kind of specialize in your consultancy is around customer retention and churn. So if we can go just a little bit deeper in that area around how the maybe share some stories of where using those two really helped you understand the cause or the frictions better than any one view would have.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so as you mentioned, I do a lot of work with companies around their retention numbers, and so I think the first thing is making sure that your team is actually looking at the right business metrics. As software as a service, that business model has proliferated. We're now dealing with a lot of different uh, growth metrics that previously didn't exist, and retention is one of them. And so there are multiple flavors, and you really have to understand in your conversations with the entire business what metric you're actually quoting. So the first major distinction is gross retention versus net retention. And so gross retention is usually what people think of when they're talking about churning customers or losing logos. So that is, I had 100 customers at the beginning of last year, and by the end of the year, I had 90 customers. So my gross retention was 90%. That's great, but that only gives you partial part of the story, and that's where the net retention comes in. Where net retention is, okay, out of those 90 customers that stayed, um, did they increase their usage? Did they buy other products? Did they increase their license size? Did they upgrade tiers? Did they downgrade? And you take everything that they did, and that becomes the net retention number. Now, I don't want to talk direct benchmarks because it can get quite involved. I've written pretty in depth on this on my blog, but depending upon the type of customer you serve, the dollar amounts of your um, the transactions for your product, et cetera. The benchmarks can vary for SMB versus enterprise, for example. But having a firm grasp on those two numbers and what the delta is between them will give you a good sense of where to start and where the problem is. The next thing that I think really helps is understanding that you want to look at those numbers and break them down further in terms of making sure that you're grouping together like customers. So often the first pass where uh, companies will do this is based upon their like annual contract value. So small customers, medium customers, large customers. And what might be surprising is that you'll find like even the customers are paying the most are actually the stickiest. The reason being is because it's a more considered purchase, and so they're more likely to stick around. It's more of an investment to get onboarded. It's more of a process to rip that out of the organization. But it can be counterintuitive when people first look at that. Of that, oh well, the people paying the most are the going to be potentially the unhappiest and leave us the most. It actually tends to be the other way. Um, and then once have those breakdowns, then it's okay, where do we see the most opportunity? And then, as the product manager, how do I go about approaching that in a very structured way? Because the thing is that you still have a highly blended group of customers, even once you've broken them up into those tiers and split out between the net and gross retention. And what I mean by that is, um, you often will have very distinct behaviors between customers who were never successfully even onboarded and those who leave you later in the cycle. And you're going to have very different reasons. And so if you just jump into qualitative discovery, customer interviews without understanding that, when you get back, you're going to have a lot of qualitative data that looks potentially confusing. So what I like to do when I'm working with clients or advising companies, I like to, work with them on segmenting out, that early stage, those early stage non-activated customers. Activation is a fairly common term that I really love because it's the agreed upon metric in the business that a customer has actually experienced value with you and is fully onboarded, um, versus so you'll have those that have been fully onboarded and those that never were. And when you imagine in a B2B context, you come back a year later for a customer that was never onboarded and they have no they're like, what were you talking about? What was that software? We never got that thing running. I don't even remember what my login is. That's gonna be a very different conversation from somebody who maybe they have other reason, they love your product, but maybe there's other reasons that they're leaving. And then I think the thing that also gets missed when folks are looking at improving their retention is they don't focus enough on the customers who are being successful. So as I've talked, I've sort of delineated two, the two kinds of churn segments, right? So the non-onboarding versus the later in the life cycle churning, but also focusing on your most successful customers, because you know oftentimes you can get misled by only looking at failure. You want to contrast that with success, and that allows you to do a few things. It really allows you, one, to direct the energy of the entire business into um, motivating your customers to take those actions that are going to make them look more and more like your most successful customers. And that may also have side effects of, into things further upstream in your go to market teams like marketing and sales, where you're able to start directing those teams and how to start attracting more of those customers. And so you'll see that stark difference as you start doing that analysis. And again, you can see in this discussion how it's not just qualitative or quantitative, but it's breaking down the business metrics into usage metrics into qualitative, so that you can start to get the full picture of what's actually going on.
But I love that example and kind of digging in there because it talks about quant and qualitative stuff and segmentation. And of course, we use segmentation with churn, and we use it throughout. Even when you look at developing personas, right? If you go, I think it's really important to consider both factors in defining how many personas you really have, just like in how many segments. If I just look at the data of how they act or perform or their demographics, I'm going to get one cut. But I also need to overlay that sort of with the psychographics and the emotions and the behaviors that you would get from the interviews. And I really do think that's the only way you kind of get the full picture of really how many you have and what they're like.
Yeah, 100%. Segmentation is key. I just don't think enough companies, spend enough time thinking about it, or working cross functionally to have a shared definition. Because I think, many times I think the product org, is in a position to create them, but then do they amplify them throughout the organization as a shared artifact? So everyone has a shared understanding of who is a good fit, who is a bad fit. There is regrettable versus non-regrettable churn. Some customers, maybe you had very talented salespeople, but they were never meant to be successful with the product you offered. Maybe you're targeting SMB and is a big enterprise customer who's going to be very unhappy for the next 10 years if they stayed with you, right? And so those things are important, making sure that your go-to-market teams understand, what does a good prospect look like, and then similarly, all the way to your support or customer success teams, how they can potentially change their um, customer success touch model based upon the needs of a particular customer segment. Um, Personas are interesting. I find that you mentioned demographics. I find that a lot of that's probably one of the biggest mistakes. And I think it's a if I think about I think it's a hangover of the old media industry and how you used to buy advertising, right? You think of any magazine and you're like, oh, this caters to 40 to 50-year-old males of this income bracket. This, caters to 20 to, 30-year-old women. And that was just how media buying was done. I find that in general, the demographic breakdowns for personas are not really valuable and quite distracting. Generally, if I'm working when I'm working with companies, I highly recommend focusing on a behavioral segmentation um, or a needs-based segmentation, and that can also filter along lines of like willingness to pay. So I do some work with pricing as well, and so those segmentations tend to offer much higher benefits because they become more actionable. Because it doesn't really tell the product team necessarily what to do to know that, oh, Dan's a 39-year-old male who lives in Texas. It's like, okay, well, it's going to be very dependent upon the needs and the other behaviors I've exhibited and whether to engage in a education campaign or engage in some sort of other outreach or offer to help move me on my journey.
Great. Another place is we talk about personas and we've talked about segmentation and we've talked about that I think is an opportunity for lots of organizations is, and I think they have the way they look at pricing and the way they look at packaging, not necessarily holistic across everything, but leveraging that segmentation information in order to make sure that we are as some of our instructors would say, we're charging each segment what they're willing to pay, because that's not always the same. And again, that is a combination of quant and qualitative in order to get to that. Right? There's behaviors you can see in quantitative. There's maybe some competitive information in there, but on the qualitative, you really start to understand why they're paying and the behaviors and maybe how the problems are more or less painful for some pieces in the organization than others. I threw a lot of different ways you could take that question, Dan, but I think they'd all be really interesting.
Yeah, yeah,
And so, yeah,
no, I you made a lot of very good points. Uh, Pricing is, yeah, obviously it's quite an in-depth topic. But I think what you said was the segmentation definitely applies or should apply for almost all companies to how they do pricing. And so if you think of your standard SaaS pricing page, usually have a good, better, best. And I think a company that has done this incredibly well, I don't know if they've changed it recently, but has been Slack, where it's a very clear progression of what each of those good, better, best packages is, who it's talking to, and that's important on so many levels. So the reason I get involved in a lot of pricing and packaging discussions is because you'll get a lot of many companies. So there's progressions in how companies handle their retention and the maturity of data they collect and analyze. But hopefully, at least if your company is not doing it yet, anyone who's listening, at least when companies go out the door, collect some sort of reason code. The problem is that usually has any data collection has bias, and so customer running out the door maybe is not willing to write you the full Dear John letter of all the of all the mistakes you made along the way, but maybe they just say price. And so often that will be a very large reason. And we could have a very reasoned debate of it's never price, it's value, but often it's the pricing was never wrapped around the value in the correct way. And so I think when you were talking about the proper segment, it's like, okay, do we really understand all of the things that a particular segment values and can wrap that in a package that's attractive to them so that we're not forcing customers to straddle to maybe the next higher tier where now we're going to run into a bunch of pricing friction because we didn't think through our packaging correctly. And it's not necessarily they're not getting value, but we've stretched, we've stretch the balance between price and value to a point that they're not willing to tolerate and stay with us because we force them into this next tier. Whereas there may be other customers that are perfectly happy and maybe will look at you as a bargain at that same tier. And it goes back to really having that sense of what is it that those customers value at each stage and making sure that you can align your pricing and packaging to that.
Those are some of my favorite topics. I have to say, I could I'd probably talk to you forever, Dan. I'm like, ooh, pricing, packaging, segmentation. These are all really great things. Um, well, I think one of the reasons people either tend to maybe push on qualt or quant, right? One, I think with let's talk about both. So if you're focusing too much on qualitative, I want to talk to you about quantitative and why it matters. And some reasons that we hear from our market of why they're not doing it is uh, accessibility of data. I think is a big place where they kind of push back. So let's talk about. Can you give us some hints for those who's like, I'd add some quantitative research to mine, but I just can't get to the data. What are your recommendations?
Yeah, 100%. And I've lived this, so I can completely relate. So, um, I got a my MBA from Kellogg at Northwestern, where the fancy marketing people go. So I took a lot of marketing research there, and a lot of those courses were built around not in product analytics or doing SQL queries, although there were some more analytics type approaches that I learned there. But you always have the ability to if you have the way we were coached to do research market research is you start with qual because you have no idea what the territory really is until you get some foundation of how customers think. And then what you do is you use the quant to back up those hypotheses that you got from the qualitative. And so you can do that with surveys. You can do that and there's many different techniques around survey and design is a whole topic in and of itself, and there's a lot of people who there's a lot of ways to do those improperly and bias your answers and results. But when I started in my PM career at SolarWinds, all our products at that point were on premise. We had some amount of user monitoring data, but it was not easily accessible. And so that was the main way we got our quantitative insight was through surveys and survey analysis. So you can get a long way on those. The As you sort of progress in you know maturity, I would say, data maturity as an organization. I think it's incumbent on the product organization, whether it's product management or product marketing, to continually push the organization to be more data driven. Um, and that starts with the product managers themselves in making sure that hey, it's not just about getting for let's assume that they have some amount of telemetry system, a product telemetry system, whether that's a homegrown solution or a third party solution like a mixed panel or an amplitude. But as the product team, it's your responsibility to make sure that you're carving out a portion of your engineering velocity in order to build out event tracking, and that and that you're as a responsible PM and a product leader, you're going to have ceremonies that support the product managers actually going back and looking at that data and what happened. Because as if you don't, what ends up happening is this consistent decay over time where the data doesn't get used, it becomes untrustworthy, and then nobody uses the data, so it doesn't get used, it becomes more untrustworthy. And so it's really, I think those the product leaders in the organization are it's incumbent upon them to really make sure that they're pushing the organization every day and everything they do to be more and more data driven. um, but yeah, I mean, there's never been more access to analytics than there is today. Everything from the companies I mentioned. I recently became like a segment certified partner. The ability to have a single you know ability to tie all of our go to market systems with our product analytic systems. The tools that 10, 20 years ago you had to be a Fortune 500 company to bring in a technical consulting firm to do bespoke. Hey, we want to pull data from between our CRM, our ERP, and our data warehouse. You now can get for a fraction of the cost. We're running out of excuses to not be data driven organizations these days.
Great answer. Okay, so let's flip the script. So I'm a person who loves quant. I'm in my spreadsheets all the time. I've got data, 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 but I'm not doing the qualitative. And I think the reason I hear the most, if I look back at my own market research, is time. I don't have time to talk to those people. I need immediate answers. What would be your response to them?
Yeah, I feel that, product managers are busy people, and you have a lot of demands. My my number one answer is talking to your customers is the number one priority on your list. No matter what else is being asked of you, it's the number one thing you need to be doing. Um, and you need to. This is difficult as well, but what I'd say is you need to structure it so that it's habitual. Because what usually when that kind of excuse or objection pops up, it's because somebody's been asked to do a bunch of discovery all at once in like, hey, this is discovery week out of the entire quarter. And that is where you run into those challenges more so where you have a system or work with your organization to set up a system such that every week I'm have 3 to 5 customer calls. And you can again, if it's your number one priority as a product manager to always be talking to your customers, 3 to 5 hours out of a 40 or 50-hour work week is not that is totally doable. But that's just set up as a system so you always have a customer conversation coming up. And it may not seem like this, but yeah, I feel like I'm in many of these situations. I'm a natural introvert. I did not necessarily enjoy getting on the phone with customers, but every time it's like going to the gym. Like I don't always feel like going to the gym, but 100% of the time I leave the gym, I'm like, oh man, I'm glad I did that. It's the same exact thing with talking to customers.
Oh, it totally is. Every time I leave, I think, why don't I just do that? I mean, obviously that's not possible, but it's so exciting. And I really like how you talked about it as the right answer is to make it habitual, right? Then you're never without the qualitative, and it just becomes a muscle that you grow. So I think that's great advice.
Yeah, and sometimes you can't. I mean, there are definitely times where it's just we need a turnaround. I don't have time to go through mock up reviews or whatever. I mean that happens, but you want to make those the exception, not the rule.
Great. All right. So we talked about a bunch of different things today. If you could get our listeners to do two things differently tomorrow based on what we talked about today, what would that be?
Oh, that's a big one. The first thing I would say is pay as much attention to how, especially if you're in a software as a subscription type business or any subscription business, pay as much attention to how you're going to retain your customers as you're worried about acquiring them in the first place. And that trickles down into how you, what features you build, how you design those features, what customers you're targeting. and the supporting systems that allow you to make sure you understand how customers are or are not being successful after they get acquired. The second would be, as product managers, make sure that you understand. I talked a little bit about the formulas for net and gross retention. Make sure you get a facility and ease with the business metrics that your senior leadership talks about and cares about. It will give you that much more persuasiveness as you're trying to move your initiatives forward. And also, you get to be the strong one in the room who's flagging early warning signals from you're going to be close to the customers, you're going to be close to the data that we talked about, and then you can tell the compelling story to your executives of how that's affecting those top line business goals.
Awesome. Dan, this was great. If people want to read more of your thoughts, can you shout out to the blog address for us?
Yeah. So I have a website. It's producttranquility.com, all one word. And you can find my blog on there. You can reach out to me for anything else. And I'm somewhat active on Twitter at Dan underscore Balcauski. But yeah, probably my website would be the better place for folks to check me out.
Product Tranquility. Awesome. All right. Thank you, Dan. It was really great having you on, and I hope we can do it again.
Appreciate it, Rebecca. Thank you so much.
All right. That does it for today's episode. Thanks, everyone, for listening. And don't forget to join us next week when we tackle another great topic designed to help you elevate your product, your company, and your career.